Today I have builds, and that's not different than normal. However, today is a build that's kind of reminiscent of the last time I spoke on Hunter. I mentioned that I deeply despise combination blow loops, and I do. I've been playing them basically since Season of Defiance, and honestly, I think they're boring. They're effective, but they're boring. And when Prismatic got combination blow, I knew I was going to have to break the mold. Of course, I've done that. I do have this grenade build that is floating around somewhere on my channel. And I highly encourage, if you're looking for a fun grenade build for Prismatic, go check that out. It's very fun. Ultimately, there's a few things that I would like to amend about that build video, but a lot of it still stands. However, I'm looking at something that isn't on the exotic class item. Gifted Conviction. This is a new exotic, and I think what it aims to do is really interesting because it not only grants more offense to Ascension and Tempest Strike by granting them jolting explosives, but it also grants a little bit of defense to very offensive abilities. In the bottom sentence there, jolting targets grants damage resistance. This damage resistance is damage resist times 2. Ultimately, I don't know what the percentages pan out to be. I don't remember their exact scaling values, but ultimately it's damage resist and it makes you a little bit more tanky. And I think that goal of making offensive abilities more defense able is very interesting. Now, this build is on Prismatic for me. Ultimately, if you want to look into doing this on on Arc rather, I highly encourage go mess around with it. I didn't find what I wanted from it, therefore I've stuck with Prismatic. But I do acknowledge that this is very strong on Arc, and Gifted Conviction can do a lot of work there. Just not for me, personally. But that means that we're only limited to Ascension. The reason why Prismatic is so good for this is because Prismatic allows for a lot of mobility-based options. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start from the abilities. Marksman dodge is kind of obvious. We're ultimately using your dodge more for Ascension than we are for the actual benefit of the dodge. But if you find yourself running into like more problems with the actual dodge than getting Ascension, you can definitely switch it up. I would just suggest straying away from Acrobats due to its very clunky feel, as well as its very long timer. But ultimately, you do you. If you find that you're using more class abilities for class abilities rather than Ascension, go for it. Withering Blade is ultimately not exactly necessary. Any of these melees theoretically work, but I think Withering Blade is the most fun. Personally, I think the instant freeze is very, very strong. However, Threaded Spike can do something very strong as well. Ultimately, I wouldn't suggest Combination Blow for this build. It isn't very strong within this kit and can't really do a lot. So, I would personally stray away. Knife Trick, despite its finicky tracking, from what I've heard, can still do some work. It does Scorch on hit, and that would prompt Stylus Executioner. However, personally, I wouldn't do it. Snare Bomb is a good debuffing tool, and I won't fight you if you're using it in a boss scenario where you're just like using it to debuff something. Ultimately, fair enough. I think Withering Blade's ability to also get like quick grenades from Transcendence is very strong. That's like another half of the reason why I run it. Grapple Grenade is an interesting thing. See, because Ascension is mobility based and very like mobile of an ability, you can kind of do some interesting stuff with Grapple. See, Ascension doesn't exactly like do anything to your momentum. It only lifts you up and chains your momentum a little bit. Meaning, you can grapple and then hit ascension, and you will just fling yourself a little bit. Pair this with blink, and you can fling yourself halfway across the map. But you could already do that with blink for the most part. However, if you don't want to take advantage of that fun little combo, any grenade theoretically works. I'll explain the mod work that I would change if you do want to use a different grenade. Um, a Stylus Executioner is ultimately something more for flavor points rather than like actual utility. Ultimately, it's very strong with Ascension, and also because of the nature of Gifted Convictions, Jolt grants damage resist. I do run a lot of Volt Shot weapons, so Stylus Executioner does come into play a little bit, but I don't really think about it too hard. So if you want to run Threaded Spectre, Wintered Shroud, or Gunpowder Gamble for that fact, go for it. Ultimately, though, only 3 fragments are really even important. Facet of Hope is the only one that I would say you can't really get rid of. Facet of Hope is very strong simply because Ascension grants you Amplified when it's active, and, well, Facet of Hope kind of feeds off that. So, you can activate Ascension and turn what would be a 20 some odd second cooldown into a 12-second cooldown. That's not a joke. I actually sat and counted with Marksman Dodge. It is 12 seconds. Um, so it's very strong, and you can activate a lot of Ascensions because of it. Even more so because Facet of Awakening. Facet of Awakening is just generating ion, or, well, any elemental pickup based off of the damage that it's done. Ultimately, a lot of the time, that is arc damage, meaning a lot of the time I'm getting ionic traces, which grant a bunch of ability energy, meaning even more class abilities. But because of the ability of Ascension granting Amplified, Facet of Sacrifice is another thing that can kind of get fed by that buff, granting Darkness Transcendence energy for ability kills while having, well, Amplified. Ultimately, a lot of this kit, despite being Darkness focused, is kind of put to the wayside for the fact that Ascension is so strong. So, ultimately, bridging the gap between Transcendence bars is very good. Facet of Protection is ultimately not necessary, but is still very strong, and also stacks with Gifted Convictions damage resist. So, I would ultimately still suggest it, but if you want to switch it for anything here, go for it. Facet of Grace is one of the like swap fragments that I normally use. This one's dependent on weapons because, well, it feeds off of kinetic weapons. I personally run Kvastov. I deeply enjoy Kvastov for basically any prismatic build. However, if you're running something like Michael's Reverence and like an undercurrent, you can certainly go for something like Facet of Purpose, granting you frost armor for wearing or having a stasis super, or having Woven Mail from Silk Strike just for picking up an orb. This just kind of feeds into more damage resist if you're running a Darkness super, but ultimately, Facet of Dominance, Blessing, Dawn, Bravery, Balance. Realistically, whatever can fit probably will fit. Just kind of up to you. Mod-wise, nothing too complex is happening. Ultimately, I run a siphon for whatever the main weapon is for the weapon setup. So if you're running like a primarily arc weapon setup, go arc. If you're running a primarily kinetic weapon setup, go kinetic. Ultimately, I don't know how Dynamo works with Ascension, so I can't fully endorse it. I do encourage that you go mess with it and see if it works, though. And if it works, happy days. But otherwise, I run heavy ammo like stuff. I wouldn't worry about it too hard. Heavy-handed and double focusing strike is widely because of grapple grenade. Ultimately, you can also run impact induction here, but if you're not running grapple grenade, and running something like dusk fields or swarms, bolstering detonation is going to be very strong for you, and I probably wouldn't complain seeing it in this build. Chestplate is chestplate. Insulation is honestly one of your best friends throughout this entire build because as much as I have a lot of mobility and a bunch of things to circumvent the ability cooldown, having that little extra bonus on top is never something that I'm going to complain about. Recoup ultimately is one of very few health regeneration things that I have within this build. Most of the fragments and aspects are very like resistance focused and not really sustain focused. So, having something to get health back is ultimately very strong. Surges are surges. Time dilation and Uto kickstart are just kind of like tried and true. Um, Powerful attraction unfortunately does not work with this uh, ascension, so I wouldn't I wouldn't touch it. I ultimately don't know if Reaper works with this either, but such is life. But that is basically the build. This was a longer video, wasn't it? Eh. I think the fact that this build has a lot to be said about it proves something that how much I enjoy it and how much I've thought about it. So, anyway, I will see you all around. Bye bye.